It's been a pleasure getting to know both of you, you guys, over the last couple of months as we hung out. And it was actually a lot of fun to do the hackathon together. I think that we all learned a lot of stuff going through it, but one of the things was just more about each other, how we work. And yeah, so anyways, with that being said, all right, yeah, let's start with like the basics of how we built what we built. So at a very high level, we can say that we built a cluster API provider for Civo. But what does that actually mean? So I thought maybe we'd start with cluster API and what that is and what it brings to the table. I know, Gregory, you're kind of our resident expert on cluster API. So I thought maybe you could give us a quick, 30-second intro into what cluster API is and what it brings.
Yeah. So first of all, I would like you to think about Kubernetes operators. So idea behind Kubernetes operators is that we could encode the operational knowledge about specific apps. So, for example, disaster recovery for app, replication or stuff. So cluster API is kind of a similar concept. It's basically an operator for an infrastructure. So there's two the most important parts of cluster API. It's a core project of cluster API, which encodes very high level logic. Like, for example, it validates if control plane is actually started before actually stating that cluster is in working state. And second part is actually provider specific component, which is called a cluster API provider. So it's actually the part that we did. So yeah, it basically knows very specific things about the infrastructure where this cluster is running, communicates with API of this infrastructure, and yeah, it's able to start like machines on that infrastructure directly. And yeah, it also can implement some more advanced logic like hibernation or some disaster recovery stuff. So yeah.
And if I might add, I think one of the things is it brings a declarative, kind of like Terraform, a declarative state to your infrastructure as well, right? It allows you to declare that your infrastructure in like a manifest file, yes?
Yeah, exactly. Because cluster API, it actually uses Kubernetes API as a base. So,
right.
Yeah.
Okay. Super cool. Jabril, how much of this did you know before starting?
Out of 100, I'd say 10%.
No, that's really cool because I just wanted to bring it up because you were actually super helpful. And I just wanted to bring it up as Jabril, you came into this not knowing as much as some of us. And I think he did a fantastic job of hitting the ground running and learning about these topics. How much did your knowledge expand on like operators and cluster API? Like, if you don't mind just talking about that, maybe just a little bit of some of the things that you learned, some of the things you didn't. Maybe you had some misconceptions of different tools before you started. I don't know if you could go into some of that. That would be awesome.
Sure. So, like you said, I came into this not really knowing anything or not much about cluster API and a fair bit about Kubernetes operators. So, yeah, it was quite rough in the beginning, but as we progressed through the hackathon, I learned quite a lot. I learned about reconciliation for the Kubernetes cluster and how and why cluster API is useful. Because initially, when I heard about it, I was really wondering like why would we need this? Terraform exists, so why should we really do this? But as I went along, I learned a lot more as to why this is important. And yeah, I learned a bunch about Kubernetes operators, and I even got to read some of the other cluster API providers that were existing already. So that really expanded my knowledge of how companies approach the same problems but different solutions depending on their platform. So yeah, that was mostly it.
And we used KubeBuilder. So everybody, when we created the Kubernetes operator, one of the things that you do is there's frameworks, and we used KubeBuilder. Had both of you used KubeBuilder before?
Yeah, it's kind of actually a customary tool for right now for building operators or just controllers in general. Yeah.
Yeah.
So before this, I had only ever used it once, and I never actually finished the project I started. But yeah, so just once before now.
Yeah, it actually is a pretty simple tool. I've used it a couple of times. Always found it fairly simple to use. I know some people use what is it called, the operator SDK. Have you guys?
But yeah, I still find it a bit confusing. The operator SDK and KubeBuilder.
Just use KubeBuilder.
Similar.
Pretend that the operator SDK doesn't exist, and you'll be fine.
Yeah, actually, I built my first Kubernetes operator back in 2018/19 on operator SDK.
You know what? I think the real strengths that the operator SDK is like their ability to do like Helm and Ansible operators. So like if you don't have Go experience, like you can bust one of those out, and that's a cool feature. But anyways, we digress. Let's talk about. Sorry.
Yeah, so actually we have a few more components like operator lifecycle manager and what's it called? Yeah, so some integration with Prometheus. So I think it's actually kind of allows to build operators for, well, I'm not, for, let's say for specific use cases, not for more advanced, like in general, but for more specific use cases, you could use it.
Very specific, high-level cases, it works really well and just kind of handles it for you, which is nice. I agree. So we built, at the core, we built a Kubernetes operator using KubeBuilder in Go. So with that being said, though, that's kind of only half of the equation there, because those are the technologies. But then what we built had to work with CAPI or Cluster API. A lot of times it's referred to as CAPI. It had to interact with both the API given by CAPI and the API given by Civo. So we're kind of the middleware, if you might say, that has to interact with both. I know, Gregory, you solved one of our hardest problems, and this is where the building that understanding between what CAPI expects with making sure the control plane is ready, and and how the Civo API worked. I know that you were the one that tackled that, and I didn't know if you wanted to talk about that just a little bit.
Yeah, sure. So actually, one of the things that Cluster API base code does is that it checks, it basically validates that control plane node is running. So it was a problem in our case because we used so basically Civo has two APIs, the Kubernetes API and the instance API. Yeah, and compute instances API. So the second one, compute instances, it's a little bit harder because you have to actually bootstrap Kubernetes nodes there. And so we go with Kubernetes API, which actually creates a Kubernetes cluster. But the problem with it is that it creates a control plane behind the scenes. So you don't have a direct access to control plane node. And that's the part that we actually had to hack on. Yeah.
Yeah. And that was I actually found that quite fun, because it's the things that don't work just standard that you get to really come up with the interesting solutions. And I think you came up with a very interesting solution to that. Jabril, you handled some of our API work with Civo, and you did like all the login. How'd that go? As far as APIs go, how was your experience with that?
I'd say my experience was quite smooth. The Civo SDK was quite easy to use. All you need to do is provide your API key, and you get a client back, and you can use that to make API calls. So it was quite smooth.
Awesome. Now, talking about that, we did come across a few things that were a little interesting. Gregory, I know that you got hit particularly hard with this one. Was there are some limits that aren't particularly exposed in the dashboard that you can hit. like the number of IP addresses you're allowed to use. And I think we ran into a bug. I think possibly they are working on fixing it or have already fixed it, where one of those wasn't getting updated, so we ran out of IP addresses. Is that right?
Yeah. So I'm not sure if we fixed it or not, but basically, as I understand that each time I created a cluster for testing, one IP address was reserved, and they didn't update the count or something in the internal database for that. So at some point, I faced the limit of available public IP addresses.
Yeah, it's interesting. It might be something that they've never seen, because in our testing, we were standing up and deleting clusters quite rapidly, because one thing Cappy brings to it is the ease of just, you can define a cluster 12 times and stand up 12 clusters in a matter of seconds. So yeah, that was an interesting little feature that we found. It was fun. All right, I'd like to then spend just a little bit of time talking about major takeaways. I know I already kind of mentioned mine. I got to know you two better, which I consider the highlight of my thing. I also got to know the Civo API quite a bit better, which I have to say is it's a super simple API. It's really easy to use. You almost don't need their CLI program, because making curl commands to it is so simple and like intuitive that it usually makes sense. Very much their API makes sense, and their Go wrapper, their Go client, was super simple to use. But I also learned a lot about Cluster API. I actually use Cluster API in my day-to-day job, but I've never actually used, or I've never made a provider. And like, I actually understand what the Cluster API is doing behind the scenes a little bit better because of that. But yeah, I'd love to hear, Jabril, what was like some of your takeaways?
Let's see. So first thing was networking is hard. Like, yeah, really hard. Second would be, I learned a lot more about Kubernetes and Cluster API as a whole. Before now, like as you mentioned in the beginning, I had not really worked with Cluster API. I had heard about it, but never really done anything with it. So I learned a lot more, and I appreciate the work that goes into these kind of projects a lot better now. And yeah, I also learned that no one really writes good code, so I feel less bad when I push bad code.
Thanks for calling my code out there, Jabril. That hurts. Gregory?
Yeah, so I guess I refreshed my knowledge on Cluster API as well. And yeah, it was my first time using Civo, so I had some experience with Civo, which is good, I guess.
Yeah. I know that another thing is we represent 3 continents. I don't know if that's a random fact, but we have 3 continents of the world represented, which I thought was pretty cool. I don't know how many teams could state that. It was a little bit of a challenge. Time zones are a programmer's worst nightmare. I think that we did it fairly well. I know that you guys stayed up a little late. I tried to get up a little early on Saturday. But yeah, I think it was a lot of fun. I actually enjoyed it quite a bit. I enjoyed getting to know you guys. Do you guys have anything else that you would like to say? Are you going to be doing another one in the next year? Jabril, another hackathon? Definitely.
Yes.
Gregory?
Yeah, I'm actually thinking about maybe taking participation in some blockchain hackathons, because I want to kind of increase my knowledge in that stuff.
I think that's actually a perfect like segue to like what I think is the best thing about a hackathon is getting to learn about something. We got to learn more about Cluster API and Civo this time. And if I'm going to be doing another hackathon or two in the next year, and I would have to say, find a hackathon that's around something that you're interested in and join it and learn something. Don't worry about whether it works or whether it's the best thing ever. Just make sure that you learn something from it. And maybe if you can, find a couple of fun people to work with and build that relationship.
I think that was one of the really cool things about this hackathon, because the audience was a bit more specific. as much as there wasn't a real theme, but it was centered around cloud native, and which was really interesting to me because you don't find these hackathons every day. So it was really nice to get to participate.